Good evening, everyone. We are working our way through the last pages of Divine Friendship by Swami Kriyananda. And as you can see, we have Keshava with us to start our evening with a couple of chants. So let's pray and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, speak to us through these letters, that the inspiration and guidance you are offering so generously to those who had called upon you at these moments in the past, let the wisdom and the universal truth of your advice then speak to our hearts now, that we may awaken from the confusion of delusion into the bright freedom of your loving presence. Om. Peace. Amen. So we'll have a couple of chants and then a few minutes of meditation before we start.
Thine,
Let's meditate now for a few minutes. Om, peace. Amen. Okay, my friends. We are now in the section of the book called Suffering and Death. That's right. I knew it had a really cheerful name. I was trying to remember what it was. And the letters here, though, are really magnificent. They're serious, of course, because the issues that are being presented to Swami are serious. We are now in this long letter, which was written in 1983. And this is a letter to somebody that Swami himself does not know. And I think this person, I think he's writing to a man, is a friend of Swamiji's. I don't know any of the actual details. And the person, Swamiji's friend, was very worried about their friend because the man had been through some very hard times. I think he had some physical ailments, maybe other disappointments, and he'd become very bitter and very, very angry, well, doubting God, not even angry, just doubting the existence of God, or if there was a God, that he was horrible and cruel and no one should love him. So Swamiji started answering it last week, just sort of saying, I'm writing because our friend asked. I think either the friend forwarded something of the man's letter or maybe there was a direct exchange, I'm not sure. So we're right in the middle of this letter. Well, Swami writes the paragraph before, my faith too in God was severely shaken. Faith not in God's existence, nor even in his love for others, but certainly in his love for me, a lack that seemed to me the more painful for the selectivity of its focus. Swami is such an elegant wordsmith, meaning God loved everyone. He was a perfectly loving God. It was Swami himself that was specifically excluded from the affections of the Lord. That was how Swami was feeling. And of course, he's referring to the time when he was separated from SRF, and after 14 years of dedicated service, being a fully professed monk, he just fell out of alignment with what the board of directors was doing, and they expelled him. And Swamiji's concept at that time of serving his guru was exactly synonymous with working within SRF. So it was just, Swami just thought he absolutely didn't know what to do with himself. He was 22 when he came into the monastery. He was 36 when he was expelled. So he'd never been a man, I'd never been a grown-up outside of the monastery. And the further condition of that expulsion was that he was not to contact any members of SRF ever. So he was completely exiled. And by that point in his life, he had no other friends. So he was left completely alone. Fortunately, Swami's parents were both still living, and they had a spacious home, and they were more than willing to take him in, and he had a harmonious relationship with them. So he went to his parents' house, but that was hardly the picture of his own life. So it was a very hard test for Swamiji, except all the great work that he did afterward was absolutely dependent on that. But Swami's devastation from that experience, he described it, that he lay on the bed in the guest room of his parents' house and prayed to die. And that was just sort of like there was no point in going forward because of this. And because all his fellow disciples had turned against him, it naturally raised the question, was the Guru also deeply displeased with Swamiji? And so there were many levels of test. So that's what he's referring to when he says, my faith too in God was severely shaken. Then he goes on to say, there was a thought that helped me at that time, and one that I hope you won't take amiss if I share it with you. For I too am a reasonable man. But during that trial, I remembered the many times in my life when my ability to reason honestly had been affected by my feelings, even to the extent of becoming totally clouded when my feelings were distorted. The logic on those occasions that had seemed so transparent, so ineluctable, that I hadn't imagined that it might be wrong. Yet, when the upset in my feelings subsided, the logic changed with them, giving me finally a calmer, more balanced perspective on matters that had at first for me seemed so chaotic. So what Swami's describing here is something that Master says, which is that reason always follows feeling. Whatever we are emotionally predisposed to favor, the mind will come up with reasons for that. And even people who pride themselves on being completely unemotional and utterly logical, we don't even know what the biases are. We have just biases in certain directions, and those biases are just feelings, and then we build around them a huge construct of reason, because the only ideas that we tune into are the ones that are consistent with the vibration that we're on. And the vibration that we're on is not determined by our logic, it's determined by our heart. And this is why it says in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Because it's the likes and dislikes of the heart and the biases of the heart in favor of one point of view that keep us in the world of duality and in delusion. So Swami says, when I was so caught up in these feelings, I thought I was reasoning brilliantly. It never crossed my mind that my reasoning was so clouded that it was completely unreliable. And only later, after he'd finally extricated himself from the waves of feeling, could he see the self-evident illogic of what he had thought was so sensible. I have certainly experienced that in my life, that it's just, things looked a certain way. And when my bias finally settled, I realized, oh, there was a completely other way to see it. But it had been absolutely invisible to me as long as my feelings were engaged. So it's, and you know, when we say to not let your feelings influence, we're not talking about the kind of dry, cold, merciless, steely-eyed, unflappable hero who never messes around with feeling or anything like that. But we're talking about a deep sensitivity, but calm, and God's point of view. In other words, just seeing everything equally instead of leaning in favor of whatever it is that we're most involved in. Looking back on those occasions, what I resolved to do during my time of severe testing was to suspend judgment for the time being and wait for a time when I might view my experience without the intense aversion which I knew was affecting my reason. So Swami's saying in this particular time of testing, he was already 14 very serious years on the path. So he couldn't tell what was going on, but he also knew that he wasn't capable of perceiving what was going on because he knew that there was too much emotion rolling through him. So he decided to suspend judgment, which is a very good way to put it. We're not really saying anything one way or another about what's going on. We're just saying it's going on, isn't it? Because any judgment that we put on it is too likely to be untrue. In fact, a clear positive outlook did come at last, though only after some years. The marvelous thing was that when it came at last, I felt nothing but grateful for what I had experienced. And of course, gratitude is generally not the first thought that comes to your mind when you're struggling, or you feel victimized, or you feel like this is very unfair, or you feel like it's simply more than I can do. You know, I have a friend he's actually a criminal defense attorney, and he's been a very he's a very fine person, and he's not part of Ananda, but he's a friend. And I've called him on various occasions when I've found myself, because our spiritual family is very large and very complex, and so interesting things happen. So a friend of mine got caught in this crazy situation where he had paid child support from an early divorce. He paid child support, every payment all the way through to the child was 18 or whatever the end point of the court requirement was. And it was all finished. But then his wife, who was not apparently a very nice person, falsified some documents and filed something with the court and got a judgment against him that said he owed all those years of child support, even though he'd already paid them all. This caused him to be branded as whatever they call an irresponsible father. His passport was confiscated, which caused him to be unable to take up a very positive job opportunity. And, it was just because of this, and the papers had been falsified. He'd never been served, so he had a default judgment on it. But it was still, there it all was. So I called my friend, the defense attorney, to see if he could help us sort out the mess. And he said, well, of course, the first thing we'll need is his bank records for all those years. I said, and he also had he was fighting cancer, and then he said, we'll need his bank records. Oh, I said, I forgot to tell you, his house burned down. And the attorney said, all he said was, it would. That was like, it would, because you just sort of get started on one of these cycles of negative karma, and it would. The bank records that you need would be turned to ash. Probably the same thing happened to the bank itself, because it would. So we have to understand a lot of the time that karma just sweeps over us. And our job when the karma is sweeping over us is not to have a well-reasoned picture of everything that's happening and why and what's true and what isn't true, because the karma is sweeping over. We're trying not to drown. It's not the time. Because all that stuff that we make up, and that's the only word I can use, so I see it, all that stuff that we make up is just going to have to be dismantled later. And it'll make it harder for us to see things in a clear perspective if we've built a whole system. It always makes me very nervous when people tell me in too much detail why things are happening and how they're happening and what this is about. Better just to suspend judgment for a little while until one can really feel that one's energy has come back to center. This doesn't mean that thoughts don't go through your mind or that you can't speculate, but just be a little open, or be as open as you possibly can. Because you will feel, I've certainly felt, and almost everyone does, there's just a point where it calms down. And you can feel, oh, I was really out there. You might just have been working so hard just to stay even that you don't realize how far off center you are. But when you finally come to rest, and then, of course, you feel grateful for what had happened, because God knows what he's doing with this. Let's see how Swami explains it more. I'm not going to ask you even to imagine gratitude for what you've been suffering and for what you've seen others suffer. Now, see, Swami is being very strategic here, because it's very annoying to be told you should be grateful for this, when that is not at all what's springing to mind, or it seems presumptuous. You should be grateful. Well, you haven't suffered like I've suffered. And in other contexts, Swami said, no, I haven't, but nor have you suffered like I've suffered. It's like each of us has been tried to the limit, even though we've been tried in different ways. But you can't tell someone to have the right attitude. It's annoying is actually the right word. I used to call it true but irrelevant. When one's energy is really off center, especially if we're talking to each other and we're serious spiritual devotees, don't tell me what my right attitude should be. I could explain it to you probably better than you could explain it to me. It's not relevant. Right now, I just need to not fall to pieces and just get through this. It's just something to realize. So that's why Swami says, I'm not going to ask you even to imagine gratitude for what you've suffered. It means Swami, the person needs to feel that Swami is sympathetic and not judgmental or dismissive. But I do ask you to consider suspending judgment for the time being. There'll be a time, suspending judgment means don't be too quick to say that God has no plan or that he's a hateful being, or whatever it is. Just suspend judgment. I'm too much in the middle of this to know. I might even put it to you this way: why suffer twice? You are experiencing physical pain. Why add to this mental torture? Indeed, if God be really the sadist you make him out to be, why give him the satisfaction of seeing you broken at last? That's sort of an odd way to put it, but you defy your torturer by refusing to have him triumph over you. So don't fall into that. It's sort of Swami working around a person who doesn't have any faith, trying to help him find a way to stay strong. I've tried this simple technique many times since those dark days in my life. Whenever things have gone wrong, and I've been tempted to get upset about them, I've told myself, this isn't the time to pass judgment. For now, let me try to accept things as they are without trying to understand what they mean. If in fact they do have a meaning for me, perhaps the meaning will come clear later. Swami often talks about the word in terms of trials and difficulties. The word that we're looking for above all is acceptance. And that acceptance does not mean complacency, it doesn't not mean passivity. Acceptance is to deal with what you're actually facing. I think of it like this. This is nothing that I've ever even come close to experiencing. But for example, let's say someone is in a very bad accident and you lose a leg. A young friend of mine who was extremely athletic and quite on his way to some kind of professional athletic career, he was riding a motorcycle and he was like a half a mile from his home, and someone driving a car reached down like this to get something like a CD or something like that. Their car drifted across the center line and just clipped him right in the leg, and he lost his leg. I think they saved his knee, and so they took it off below the knee, but there he was 20 maybe, and just like that, just everything has shifted. And so imagining a situation like this, it's like it's gone. Something is different. You're never going to have that limb again because it's been taken off your body and you're an adult. It's not going to come back. So at a certain point, you have to accept the fact that my whole context has changed, and now I have to start moving forward in the context of this new context. I can't, and I know that sometimes people injured like this do, just lie in bed and wish things were different. At a certain point, you have to accept what you're working with. Now, of course, in the case of an amputation like this by accident, it is amputated, and there are things that you have to do, but you don't have to accept that my life is over, that I'm crippled, I can never do the things I love. There's all these other things. You don't have to take this dire reality, but you do have to say, if I'm going to have any of that back, I have to now accept what I'm working with. So that's what Swami was saying. You don't have to understand. You don't have to make a story about why this is all happening, or who did what to me, and who ought to apologize or do this or do that. I don't have to understand it. I just have to know that these are the conditions and I have to go forward. Because true understanding tends to take a little longer. And true understanding also tends to emerge out of what happens to us when we begin to participate in this new reality. Because the answers to things are not rote. I know there are schools of healing and so on, and I'm not adept at them or even very familiar, but I know it exists, where someone says, well, if you lose a leg, it means this. If you break an arm, it means that. If you have problems with your kidneys, it means this. And just sort of putting a meaning on these experiences. If you lose money, it means this. If you lose romance, it means that. And there may be some validity to all of that, but my own personal way of trying to understand what happens to me is to watch how I react. In other words, what does it bring out of me? Because what it brings out of me is going to tell me what the purpose of it is. And if it brings out, horrible, despairing anguish or insane fury or complete pathetic, what a victim I am, nothing ever goes my way, if it brings out of me this, I'm not going to let this stop me, a positive, or I refuse to stop being gracious and kind no matter what happens, that's how I can tell why it happened to me, is what are the consequences of it. And I don't mean the obvious consequences. I don't mean the material consequences necessarily, but on a level of consciousness and on the level of the attitudes that are essential for success in my spiritual life, how is it challenging me? And you have to be calm enough to really be able to think that one through. Oh, look, look at this. Look at who I am. I didn't know that I was capable of this. Either both ways. I didn't know I had so much strength. Master said, God does not test us in order to break us. He tests us in order to show us that we have unlimited power within. And so we discover, I didn't know I was this strong. I didn't know I could do this. Or worst fear is realized and it's not so bad. Life goes on. But it takes time, and we can't be quick to judge, because in one more time I'll say it, if we figure it all out really fast, it tends to be shallower than what will come to us later. And if we believe our own rhetoric, we may miss the deeper lesson. So, let's say, so far, Swami says, understanding has always come clear in the end. So then Swami says, if this weren't a letter, I'd probably end with that thought, but who knows whether I'll ever be writing to you again. So let me add one or two further points. First, an interesting statistic. Of all the people, in all countries, in all periods of history and in all religions, who seem in some way to have known God, not one has expressed bitterness toward him. It's very interesting. There's this unanimity among the saints. Not one has expressed bitterness toward him, though in fact not a few of them passed through bitterness to reach him. It's very interesting. It's not like they weren't tested. It's not like they weren't crushed. But they somehow survived being crushed. And then when they finally understood, they always felt that God knew just what he was doing. And like Swami, they were grateful for what happened. Knowing God, their vision has become one of underlying goodness, indeed of perfect love, spurned by man, who willfully keeps his back turned to God. Now we're getting into the very complex philosophical points here. That it's not God who isn't loving us, it's we who are not receiving what he's sending. Second, their bitterness, fanned by suffering, sometimes proved to be the very emotion they needed to turn toward God, for only in their bitterness against him did they begin to think of him seriously. In other words, when all else fails, you have to go to the infinite answer, because nothing in this finite world is working. So even if at the beginning you look to the infinite and are enraged and angry, at least now we're trying to understand life from a not superficial level. And a lot of times that is the purpose of what happens to us. It's just we need to get serious. And we're not going to get serious as long as the toys keep flowing. The toys keep coming, we can just keep playing. Why would we put out the effort to get serious? So, because Divine Mother loves us, she just takes all the toys away. and forces us to have to deal with life on a deeper scale. Previously, in forgetfulness of him, they may not have known intense pain, but neither had they known joy and freedom from those errors of living that had resulted in pain in the first place. So until we really know God, we're just an accident waiting to happen. And we may, skirt through in this lifetime or that lifetime, and we may get through, years at a time. But nothing will ever satisfy us except God realization. This isn't God's punishment. This is the way we're made. The awareness expands, and as awareness expands, we get a deeper and deeper understanding of what true joy is, and we are compelled by our own nature to seek it. And sometimes the force needed to compel us with sufficient energy and determination comes to us as great loss, of whatever great loss in one form or another. And it's hard to imagine being grateful, but we are in the end. That's all I can say. I can't tell you how many things have happened in my life that I learned not only what I needed to learn, I learned what I really wanted to learn, but just wasn't able to grasp. I knew it was out there to be gained, but I could never get there until Divine Mother, picked me up by the scruff of the neck and shook me hard and dropped me down in a new slot. And just time after time over the years, oh yeah, there it is. Now I know. And I'm so grateful because now I know. And before I was locked out of that understanding. So, even though we might not have known intense suffering, nor have we known the kind of joy that comes from freedom from those errors of living that bring about pain in the first place. In thinking of God, even with bitterness, the time came at last, through their resulting attunement with Him, when joy drove out all other thoughts, leaving them as I became finally grateful. And when I was working at the Expanding Light retreat at Ananda Village, for a few years, my job was to do the weekend retreats. And one of the retreats, there was a woman there from Sweden. Yes, from Sweden. And this was in the early 80s, and people traveled, but not as freely and as much as we do now. So, Sweden was a long way to come. And she came to America deliberately to come to Ananda retreat. And the story she told was this. She was a woman in her 30s, maybe she was a young woman. She was her sibling was her sister, who was very close to her in age. They were extremely close. They loved each other dearly from when they were small, and they remained close as they grew up. They had planned that they would marry men who were friends with each other, and they would have their houses right next door to each other, and they would raise their children together. Everything was all worked out. Except that in her late 20s, her sister got cancer. And despite every effort, her sister died. And so this woman said that the death of her sister plunged her into a kind of emotional suffering that she never even imagined that degree of suffering was possible. And she was suffering so intensely that she prayed with more energy than she had ever known was possible to pray. And it wasn't because she had great faith in God, but because everything else was ripped away from her. And as a result, she had experience of God answering her prayers that was, again, beyond anything she had ever imagined was possible. And because of that, she went on a spiritual quest, which is what had brought her to Ananda at this point. And of course, she was saying, she was absolutely thrilled to be there. Everything she was learning about Master's teaching was completely saving her life and changing her life. How could she have not known about this? What a glorious opportunity was now hers, now that she had this spiritual understanding. So I took a big chance and I said, given all that's happened to you as a result of your sister's death, would you call your sister's death a tragedy? And it was a bit daring for me to have said that, but fortunately I intuited it correctly. And she said, I always thought it would be a tragedy, but she said, now I don't know what to call it. Because that's what happens. It's just like a whole world opens up to you because you've been shifted in ways you wouldn't have chosen, but you did want what came after. So these are the ways in which one develops this faith in God, that even if we don't understand, there's been enough previous experience, that's what Swami was talking about, to know that I will understand someday. And if I just wait. Very important. The history of pain itself makes a fascinating study, Swami says. Again and again, one finds stories of people who, having emerged from the darkness of suffering, have exclaimed with full hearts, I see now why I had to go through it all. In no other way could I have gained what I've gained or learned what I've learned and know now. So one becomes very confused. With that woman, we even had a discussion about whether or not her sister's dying was her sister's gift, that it was, I don't know how to think about these things, but people say things like, it was an agreement they made before they incarnated, that they would be sisters, but one of them would die, and then that die would be the spiritual catalyst, that death would be the spiritual catalyst for the other. So was it really an accident, a tragedy, or was it just exactly what we planned? I can't say, but it's worth asking the question. A final thought, Swami writes, my spiritual teacher used to say, conditions are always neutral. They appear happy or sad, beneficial or harmful, according to the positive or negative attitudes of the mind. Please think about that statement. On first reading, it would be so easy to toss it aside. But I've tested it for nearly 35 years now, and I've never known it to fail. Conditions are always neutral. Whether we experience them as happy or sad depends on the predisposition of the mind. There's a great deal about the teaching of self-realization that is so challenging. And it's not like it's, oh, sometimes conditions are neutral, but other times they're not. It's either true all the time or it's not true at all. Now, we might not always be able to live up to it, but the difference between our failure to live up to the teaching is quite different than to call the teaching itself false. And it's sort of a way of, we can't make ourselves feel better by taking the height of the challenge and pulling it down to the level where we're already standing. We have to have the courage to see how high the mountain is, to honestly accept where I'm standing, but not try to bring it down. So conditions are always neutral. If we can't understand it, just put it on the shelf. That's what I did at the beginning with a lot of things Swamiji said to me. I just put them on the shelf because I couldn't reject them, because I respected him too much, but I couldn't understand them, and I certainly couldn't conform to them, so I just put them on the shelf and just waited until such time as I could understand it. And over time, everything, even the things that seemed the most incomprehensible, they just gradually made sense. It wasn't his problem, it was mine. It was that the teachings were too big for me. But as I gradually have persevered, we've come closer together. And I can't say that I realize them, but I don't reject them anymore. Oh, I can see why that's true. I can see that's where we're going. I can see that's the path to freedom. Joy to you, Swami writes. I am perfectly certain, much more so than I could possibly convey in a letter, that under the veil of your present suffering there is joy, and that even the suffering is a part, albeit difficult to understand now, of a larger and very important plan for your highest soul welfare in divine friendship. You know, what Swami's trying to put across to this man is an extremely important teaching for all of us to absorb, not merely for ourselves and our own difficulties, but so that we can be actually and appropriately helpful to others. If any of the predictions are true, and just a few weeks ago we were going through all those letters of Swamiji about the difficulties this world is going to come through, if we're going to be of any help to anyone, if conditions get really serious, we have to be able to stand calmly and strongly in the understanding that what is happening is for the best welfare of all. And that and this does not make you uncompassionate, and this does not make you disdainful of the fact that other people can't keep their equanimity. This is what I was saying about that there are times when spiritual teachings are not relevant. I mean, word teachings, philosophy teachings. The truth of spirituality, which is compassion and kindness, is always relevant, but ideas are not always relevant. They're just irrelevant at that point. But if we're really going to be of any positive benefit to people, we have to have real faith. We have to have faith that's been tested in the fires, so that when others around us get caught up in whatever it is that God is going to ask of them, we don't panic. I've mentioned on several occasions that I've been present in a number of occasions when people have died, left their body. A couple of times close friends, my own father, sometimes people that were just part of our spiritual community who asked me to be present when they or someone close to them was transitioning, either close to the time of death or actually at the time of death. And I'm certainly not a medical person, and it's not like I know this field. I know more than some just because I've had some experience by now over many years. But it's not an expertise of mine. But I really understood that what is needed in times of difficulty is for someone who's calm and not afraid. Now, I have plenty of fear, so it's not like I'm not afraid. But I'm not afraid of people dying. I rather like the idea that we all die. Death to me is not an enemy, it's a friend, and it's just a natural part of things, and we have to go through with it. And I do believe that God has a plan for us, and what looks like suffering and what may cause us to plunge into grief will eventually be an important teacher for us. I mean, you don't have to impose those thoughts on other people, but if you can just quietly hold them, and not hold them like it's my job to hold them because after all I'm the clergy. No, we just hold them because that's the way it is. You may be weeping in sadness with people at the same time because what they're going through is sad and is hard. But we can still know behind that Divine Mother is in charge. So it's all worth considering. That's why these are extremely important letters here. Okay, so this was written in 1991, and the topic is on humility and grace. Again, I have a suspicion who this might be, but I really don't know. Actually, I don't even have a suspicion. I have no idea. Swami writes, I'm sorry you've had to accept chemotherapy, but at the same time, I'm deeply relieved to hear that it isn't as unbearable as you feared and as it was for you 2 years ago, and above all, that it's helping you. So he's sympathetic. I'm so sorry you had to have chemo again. He's not, see, and this is, Swami is showing us how to be a real devotee. he just, I'm sorry you had to do this. It's not like, buck up, girl, whatever it is you have to do, just do it. No, I'm sorry you had to do it, but I'm glad it's not as bad as you feared. He's very human and very natural. Keep at the work of getting well. At the same time, however, concentrate above all on living close to God. I pray for you. There was a woman in our Sangha here who became ill with cancer. Let's see, how would this have gone? Let me think for a minute. It returned. She had a serious bout with cancer, and then she had 6 or 7 years, and then it appeared elsewhere in her body, and it eventually took her life, and not too much longer after that. Let me think what the point was there. But she asked the question. Actually, this question has been asked multiple times. It was asked by a man who had Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. He was in a state of steady deterioration that would result in his death. It was asked by this woman who had what seemed to be a terminal cancer diagnosis. It was asked by a woman who had AIDS, and she had AIDS in the early 80s, at a time when the medical treatment for it was not as highly developed. So to have AIDS was pretty much of a death sentence, and a fairly rapid death sentence. And so the question that all of these people asked when they were faced with something that by any common sense medical appraisal was going to end in their death, and not necessarily in a very pleasant death, but in their death. So the question was, I'll start with the man who had ALS. You know, he asked Swamiji, what should I pray for? You know, should I pray to get well? Should I pray to die soon? You know, should I pray to be spared the suffering? What should I pray for? And Swami said, don't pray for anything. He said, just pray to be close to God. He said, just ask God to stay with you. Because, well, Swami didn't have to explain. You don't know what the right thing is for you. What you want is God's will. And he had a young family. I mean, it was a tough one. And in the end, he passed away from the illness. There was no miracle healing. But he healed in many very dynamic spiritual ways. So when we continually strive to get well, we may be focusing that on keeping the vitality and the viability of the body, but the effort to do that is to remain in an uplifted, positive state, because when the body goes away, the consciousness that we formed through those last weeks, months, or days will go with us. And so when the woman who had the terminal cancer diagnosis asked Swami again, the same thing, what should I pray for? Swami says, pray to be in the light. That's how he put it to her. And she put up she was very visually oriented. She got a piece of this Mexican sculpture, which is sort of beaten silver. It was a sun, and it reflected the light. She put it in her room where her bed was, and sometimes the morning sun would hit it, and it would be very bright. And it was a sun itself, and it just constantly reminded her. It wasn't the physical sun that Swami was speaking of, but it was a symbol of the divine light. And she would see it, and it would remind her just to be in the light. So if I'm in pain, be in the light. If I'm worried about leaving my husband in my home, I just try to be in the light. You know, if I have to face a difficult treatment, I try to be in the light, the same as the other man. I pray for God to be with me. Because if God is with me, and if I'm in the light, then everything else will follow from that. Making myself well is just another way of saying, I want to be right with God. I want things to go right. My idea is that I should have a better body, but where does that idea come from? What we really want is to be in the light. And the last question, the third example of people asking Swami was the woman who had AIDS. Because it was earlier in the treatment of that, the treatments were complicated and often in themselves debilitating, which is true of the chemotherapy also. And she's had 2 other death and return experiences, the woman who had AIDS. And so she was, the idea of death just didn't bother her at all. She wasn't afraid to die. She'd already been there and she knew it was easy. In fact, just before she contracted AIDS, she had had this near-death experience and she'd been sent back and told that she was going to, she was going to have to go through a lot of hard things, but she needed to go back. So she knew why she was there. But she said to Swami, how hard should I try to stay alive? She said, some of these treatments, it's like having the flu all the time. It's like, how long should I try to just stay in my body? I'm perfectly happy to get rid of it now. Well, Swami's response to her was, and it was honest, you know, the likelihood is you'll have to reincarnate. So you're not going to be able to escape being in a physical body completely just by shedding this one. You're likely to come back, and then you're going to have to go through childhood and adolescence, and you're going to have to go through all that you had to go through just to find your spiritual path, to get Kriya, to get focused on self-realization. He said, to just get back to where you are now will require a lot of effort. So he said, you should keep your body as long as you can, because as long as you can continue to make spiritual progress. He may have even also put as long as you can meditate, as long as you can practice Kriya, or another way to say that is as long as you can continue to grow spiritually, just take advantage of what you've already gained in this life. Don't throw it away. And so she did, actually, and she lived for 6 or 7 years, I think, much longer than anyone expected her to. And Swami himself said, when she passed, that she grew a great deal spiritually during that time. But then she reached the point, well, actually, opportunistic infection came and took her. But you do reach the point where it's just the body is too much of an impediment. And it's just better to just say, all right, Lord, you can have it if you want it, you know. But you don't feel that as a defeat. You know, you're still perfectly well, and you're still in the light, and you're still with God, and the body's doing what it's going to do. So you don't die with the thought of sickness, you know, of, oh, I'm so sick, oh, the cancer killed me. You know, you just don't want to be thinking like that. I've been told that when you go to the astral world, and I've seen this, heard this verified in multiple places that I believe, if you've been ill for a long time, sometimes you carry over into the astral world the thought of old age and illness. And so if you die with a bright thought that I'm perfectly fine, it's only the body that isn't doing so well, you keep the idea of wellness all the way through. This is important because Master said, you know, never give in to the thought of illness. But sometimes you're obviously dying, and it's just kind of like helpful to everyone around you if we can all just talk about the fact that you're dying and that you're not going to have to worry about this anymore. A friend of mine, she had terminal cancer. She talked to the doctor. She made a plan for how much intervention she wanted to just leave her body. And a week before she died, I don't know what happened, but a friend was visiting with her, and the friend just out of habit said, oh, your hair looks so cute like that. Whatever the haircut was, I don't know, but just spontaneous girls to girls, well, that's a really nice haircut on you. And the dying woman said, because she was still completely conscious, she said, I'm going to be the cutest little corpse you ever saw. Just completely at ease. You know, it's like, and then of course, my friend also started laughing because she realized how silly that was. It was just, there we were being friends, and it was just what you might say, girls would say to each other. But being at ease with that, but being in the light. So it's just like, so the body's going, that's okay. I remember a friend that, I didn't know this woman well. It was because of my role, I was invited to meet her, and she was dying probably of cancer. Yeah, I think it was cancer. But when you're getting close to death, sometimes the life force withdraws from the periphery of the body. And your legs don't work so well, your hands don't work so well. And this woman was still ambulatory, but she'd lost sort of connection with at least one of her arms. And it was sort of bumping into things, and she wasn't even aware of it. And she was laughing and sort of pulling it back. And when we left, she just said, well, see you on the other side, because we knew that she was going to leave this world, which she did just a couple of days after. See you on the other side. Yes, of course, we'll see you on the other side. And so we go into this with a very uplifted spirit. This is the truth of it. Oh, I know what I was going to say about we don't necessarily know that we've died. And sometimes if you die suddenly, you don't know that you've died. When this is being recorded, it's September 8th, so we're almost up to the 9/11 event. September 7th. I was close, wasn't I? And so we were up to, and when the 9/11 happened, and a lot of people were in those office buildings just carrying out their day, and then all of a sudden, like in seconds, they were in the astral world. So all of their energy was on the telephone trying to reach somebody to make some big deal, and then all of a sudden they're in the astral world. A psychic woman wrote later, she said that the subway was full of ghosts. Just people who just were still trying to get back to work because they just hadn't, it all happened so fast they had no time to get ready for it. And she actually said, because she had the ability, she was one of those people who could see spirits, and she started just riding the subways. And it was just like became her job. She would ride the subways and she would see these confused souls, and she would try to get them oriented to go into the light, just explaining to them what had happened to them. And I had 2 dreams of my own mother. My mother had Parkinson's for 15 years. And it was actually, this is the way, talking about the previous letter, my mother was a little willful. She didn't have a lot of discipline, and she liked to have things the way she wanted them. She was a very sweet woman, but that was one of her characteristics. But when that illness came to her, which I have to think now, my goodness, she was 65 or so. You know, now that I'm 74, and I think about how long she was sick and how young she was when she got sick. She had to struggle. She had to use willpower, concentration, determination in a way that she just never had to before. My father took very good care of her. Her father had taken good care of her. So she said to me in the last years, she sort of said it like this: "This disease has been the making of me," she said. "I hate to say it. I hate to admit it. But it's true." And it was true. It's just, she died a much stronger, more focused, more capable person than she would have been if she didn't have to go through that. But because she had to struggle with that for 15 years, and when she died rather suddenly. Parkinson's, this is something that we all knew about it from the beginning. It often, at a certain point, starts really affecting the brain, and you start having seizures. So she had just started having seizures, and she had 1 or 2. It was the 2nd or 3rd seizure that she had. She went to the hospital and she died, just like that. I mean, and she was still walking around and talking, and, she was impaired, but she was still living her full active life with my dad. No, that would be way overstating it, but she was still having a life. She wasn't on her deathbed. There was no deathbed. She had a seizure. She went to the hospital, and the next morning she was gone. When my sister called, I happened to be in Europe as it was. She said, "Mom died this morning." I said, "Good for her." Meaning, good. She took the moment, she got out of the body. It was really not working for her now. But I had a dream about her, not too much after that. And I believe it was a true dream. And she was in the astral hospital. And she was still old and sick. And she was like in her early 80s when she died. But Parkinson's makes you look old. And much of what we think of as really debilitated old age is actually Parkinson's because of what it does. So she was still really old, just as she was the last time I saw her, which was a few days before she died. And my mother did not have a willing trust of other people's competency or their trustworthiness. And I had to do a lot of things for her in the last years that really other people could have done, but she didn't trust other people to do them. So I had to do them. Sometimes I had to fly to Los Angeles, where she lived, from San Francisco, and I had to just take care of her. So we're there in the dream. My mother's sitting on this bed. I know that we're in the astral hospital somehow. And she's motioning to me to come sit next to her. So I go and sit next to her. She sort of looks around to make sure that we're alone and no one is listening. And she kind of says to me, in the same way she would talk to me, "There's some things that I really need you to take care of," like this. And I said, "Mom, I think there's a lot of people here who could help you." She kind of looks a little bit furtively and says, "I don't think so," like that. And I said, "No, actually, I think they can take care of you." And then I backed away from her. And just because I even in the dream, I somehow knew what was happening, which is that she needed to embrace where she was. And this was very typical of my mother. She was holding on to her own point of view, regardless. And that was the first one. Then the second dream was, I was with my father in the dream. I was with my father. My mother shows up, but she's not old and sick anymore. She's young and beautiful and vibrant and just lovely in every way. And she's really come to see my dad because she and my father were very close. And they go into this their own bedroom and shut the door, which is, of course, what parents always did. And but after a few minutes, she starts calling my name. And I open the door and I go in there, and I see her literally right in front of me. She's like beginning to shrink into the way she was when she died. She's aging and she's losing her vitality, just like this. And I grabbed her in the dream and I pulled her to the door and I pushed her out of the room. And I said, "It's too soon, it's too soon. You can't be with Dad yet," like this. And I pushed her out of the room, and then I woke up. Because I think it was like she had sort of shifted her identification enough so that she could manifest this young and beautiful body again. But as soon as she came in close association with the world that she'd left, which she was very attached to, it was too much like this. Very, very, very interesting. Actually, there was a third dream. And in the third dream, she showed up again in a young, beautiful body. This was before my father died. My father lived for 2 more years. After my father died, I never heard from her again. It was my father that was her real attachment, which is fine. She loved me. She was a lovely mother. But my parents, we had 56 years, and they were very, very devoted to each other. And she was young, and she was lovely. And we just stood at a window and looked out over some kind of a green lawn or something like that. But it was because I could see she'd made it. I could see that she'd gone through the whole transition, and now she was at peace. And then she hung around kind of pestering my dad until he finally left his body. And then after that, that was it, really. She just, on a huge psychic level, she just disappeared. All 3 of her children, my brother and sister and I, we all felt her just disappear. And we'd all felt her hovering until she got my dad. I can just see her being so crabby. His name was Murray. "Murray, what were you doing? I was there and you were here. Why was that?" And I'm sure it was just fine. But that's what we're working with. We're working with an extremely fascinating and tremendous dynamic in which whatever it is that we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it, it's really, really something. And Swami here is talking about it. Concentrate above all, he says, keep at the work of getting well. Keep your willpower up, be dynamic, keep putting out energy. See, part of this is you want to keep putting out energy. And there's a point at which you may stop putting out physical energy, but you still want to keep putting out energy. Keep working at being well. And that doesn't necessarily only even primarily mean healing the body, but work at being well. You know, when Swamiji once had been having really a difficult physical time, and he was in Italy at that point, and I went to visit him, and when I saw him, I said, Swamiji, you know, with just as a friend, how are you feeling? And I knew, and he knew that I think he'd been in and out of the hospital, knows what. He had lots of crises. He said, compared to eternity, just wonderful, he said. Which is, yeah, right now, things are a bit up and down, but an eternity of bliss, what does it matter? So that was where he was. So keep working at getting well. At the same time, however, concentrate above all on living close to God. So here this person, after 2 years, the cancer has returned. They're having to take the chemo again. They've already been through horrible chemo. Keep trying to get well, because it's good for your willpower to do so. But above all, live close to God. Yes, to echo your words, be humble. It is so easy to think we are the doers, because in a sense we really are. It is our right attitudes and thoughts that draw divine healing power and guidance into our lives. It is our right attitudes and thoughts that draw healing power and guidance to us. And see, that's what's really important. It's when we attune ourselves to a higher dimension of reality, of truth, that then those vibrations can come into us. He says, the more we pride ourselves on what we've done, however, the less open we find ourselves to that power. So remain sweet and humble. I am praying for you. Remain sweet and humble. Isn't that just, those are really nice words one should put up on one's mirror and closet door and every other place. Remain sweet and humble, because then the divine power will be able to come into you, and we will be able to be all of the divinely glorious things we long to be, but they come in a different way. They don't come from this egoic force. They come when we're sweet and humble and allow that energy to flow through us. I mean, you can be a very seemingly dynamic and powerful person, but it's the energy flowing through you. It's not my will being asserted. Be sweet and humble. Okay, one more, which is about serious illness. This was written in 2006. And it says, I am so sorry. His Swami always starts like that. I'm so sorry. He doesn't start any of these letters like, well, what did you expect? He always starts them, I'm so sorry, because he is. Master talked about, after I'm gone, he said, I will weep through your eyes. I will weep through my eyes, I will weep through your eyes when you suffer. The Masters suffer with us. They are us. They feel the feelings within us that cause us to be sad. And Swami, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that this challenge, you have to meet it. He doesn't say, that I'm going to take it away from you, or that you don't have to do it, or there's not a good reason. But I'm so sorry, because I know this is going to be hard. I'm so sorry. At the same time, you will find this too a great blessing if you take it in the right way. So he says it will be a blessing if you take it in the right way. In other words, this is not automatic. I'm sorry you have to go into this. You will find it a blessing, if you take it in the right way. Because Swami was very realistic, and I don't know who he was writing to, so I don't know what the context would be that would call that. Master does want you to resist this disease with faith and with will. At the same time, he wants you to offer the fruits of even this battle to God. This is the thing that I've seen people get caught in, because Master does want us to try to get well. But we have to practice it as Nishkam Karma. I'm going to do everything I can, but there's no tension in this. I'm just going to face every opportunity with the best energy that I can give it, but I'm also just going to give my life to you. It's in your hands. Don't think of your body as your own. Now there's a very interesting way to put it. You know, it's an I and my body are not the same thing. It's God's body, from which at least the consciousness of illness must be banished, from which at least the consciousness of illness must be banished. So that's what we're really trying to get rid of. The body itself, it's God's body, and I'm not quite sure what he's doing, but I am wonderfully well. There's a funny story in my book, Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him. I mentioned that he just had a whole host of physical problems. He had congestive heart failure, and he had problems with his kidneys, and he had arthritis in both hips. He actually had 3 hip replacements, even though he only has 2 hips. One of them had to be done twice, and he had compression fractures in his spine. He used his body to work out a lot of karma that wasn't his karma. He worked out karma for many of us. He worked out karma for Master's work. But so his body was really a vehicle. He used it a lot. He used it very hard. And he was at a doctor once, and he had to fill out this, all this form, the symptoms, and it was just yes, yes, yes to everything that was asked. And then at the end it says, how would you rate your overall health? And Swami said, excellent, just excellent. And it wasn't an affectation on his part. He knew perfectly well that all those things were going on, but how was his health? How was his vitality? How was his well-being? Excellent, simply excellent. And that didn't mean even that he had energy. It's just that he was excellent. He was excellent partly because it wasn't his body. It was just surrendered. God is using this body. And Swami did everything that he could do to keep that body going until he couldn't. He had a full-time nurse, Miriam, who traveled with him all over the world. At the end of Swami's life, he lived, sequentially in Italy and India and in the U.S. He had homes in all 3 places, and every few months he would just move around. And he had a staff of 5 or 6 people, a cook, a housekeeper, at the end a caregiver, companion, a secretary, and a nurse. And Miriam was highly trained in critical care nursing, so she was very, very good. And her full-time job was to watch Swami medically and take care of him. And it was very important. And he had, discussed death with her. And he had told everyone that, if critical care decisions have to be made about me, about whether to continue treatment, whether to discontinue treatment, if he was not conscious to make those decisions, he wanted us all to know that Miriam was the one who was going to make those decisions. And then she told all of us, especially Dr. Peter, because she was only a nurse. But I say only, that's really not fair. But her license was as a nurse, but she was very attentive to Dr. Peter also. She made sure that we all understood that we would have to help her if she really had to make those kinds of decisions. And she knew generally what Swami wanted. But there came a point when they were in Pune, Italy, in India, which would have been around 2010 or 11. Swami died in 2013. When Swami went into acute renal failure, and his kidneys were just shutting down, and it was, a question of dialysis, and could he really ever recover sufficiently, or would he be on dialysis for the rest of his life? And it was a really bad moment, and the treatment measures were becoming a little bit extreme, that Miriam actually really wondered whether she should just take him home from the hospital. Because Swami had said, if at all possible, I'd rather die at home than in the hospital. So she said to him, he was barely conscious, Sir, I think we're at one of those points. We're there, Either we stay here and it's going to be pretty rough, or we just say that this is the time and I'll take you home. And she said it was very interesting because Swami had been barely audible when he would be talking. He was so weak and so compromised in so many ways. But he was silent for a little bit of time. And then she said, with a very strong voice, much stronger than anything she'd heard from him that whole incident, he said, "I think I have more to do," or words to that effect. "There's more that I can do to serve Master. It's not time for me to leave the body." And so she said, okay. So they kept him in the hospital, and he came through it and lived several more years and did a number of more very important things before he passed. But it was just like, there's a point at which, it's just time to go. But how is your overall health? Oh, just excellent. Because I'm close to God. I'm living in the light. It's not my body. It's just been given to me to use. And if Divine Mother wants to keep me in it, that's fine. Swami also had another, it wasn't part of that same cycle, I don't think. I'm going to just tell this last story and that'll be the end. Let's see exactly how did this go. Oftentimes when he would shift from one country to another, there would be a lot of fight in his body. And usually Miriam would just keep moving. And as soon as they got to the next locale, then his vitality would restore. But this was a shift from India to Italy, and I had gone to India to see him, and I was traveling to Italy with the group. But even when he got to Italy, he didn't recover as he usually recovered. He remained ill for another, month maybe. I mean, very seriously ill. This was before Narayani was always with him. In the last few years, Narayani moved into his house, and then when she married Shurjo, they both lived in the house with Swami, so he was never alone. But this was a period of time where his house in Italy, he lived alone. His house in India was shared by more people. It was just an ashram house. But in India, he lived alone, and he really liked that. But when we got back to Italy, Miriam, none of us felt safe leaving Swami by himself. He was that ill. So different ones of us, usually Anand would spend the night and others of us would spend the day. And as it happened, I was with Swami on this afternoon, and he had a miracle healing, was the only way you could say it. I had to wake him up because people were coming over. He was so weak, I had to button his shirt. He just didn't have the life force. Like some older people get, sometimes they just can't take care of the most basic things. So I buttoned his shirt, helped him into the living room. He stretched out on the couch. I took him from where he'd been in bed, and then he's on the couch, and he immediately lies down on the couch. I went back to do a few things in the bedroom when I had a chance. I came out in 5 minutes or something like that. Swami was lying with his hands across his chest. It seems to me like they were crossed in the classic posture, of someone who's left their body. And he was completely still. And I thought, oh my, I'm the only one here, and Swami has just died. It was really like, oh boy, I don't even know how to use the telephone. Like, how is this going to happen? But then, fortunately, he came out of it. And he later said that Divine Mother had appeared before him in some way. To me, he never gave me all the details, but there was a superconscious experience, and he just said, whether I live or die is really up to you, whatever you want. And when he came out of it, his vitality and his health was returned. And at that point, he decided to start the Nayaswami order. And he actually said, this is what Satan was trying to stop by making me so ill and trying to take me out of my body. He was trying to stop me from doing this. But apparently there'd been some kind of increasing crescendo between the light and the dark. And when it really came and the light was there, do you want to leave your body? Swami said, whatever you want. This is not my body. Divine Mother, this was 2009 in June. Apparently Divine Mother thought, no, you have more to do. And so he started the Nayaswami order. And from being too weak to button his own shirt. He got up, went into his office, and started writing a book. He wrote the book, A New Renunciate Order for a New Age. And that night he calls 12 people over to his house to tell them all about this thing he was doing. I mean, just hours before. You know, it's just like, there's so much. Swami's body was particularly strange because it wasn't his karma. So it wasn't personal karma for him. It wasn't his lessons. It's your body. And a lot of karma can be worked out through the body of a highly realized soul, as Swami was. So his body could really do dramatic things, depending on how that karma was running. And that was certainly a day to remember. That's all I'll say. All right, my friends. God bless you.